Hey everybody, welcome to the wonderful world of Remnant Radio. My name is Joshua Lewis, and today I've got Dr. Elizabeth Lewis Hall with us today. She's going to be discussing Christian suffering, lament, the Trinity. It's going to be a really exciting discussion. Before we dive into the subject, I just want to let you guys know what to be looking forward in this episode, so you guys stay tuned. You are watching The Remnant Radio, a crowd-funded show where we interview pastors, teachers, historians, and theologians from different churches and denominations. My name is Joshua Lewis, and this is my co-host, Michael Rowntree. Together, we want to help you break outside of your theological echo chambers. If you're interested in learning about history, theology, or the gifts of the Spirit, this is the show for you. Guys, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. It's a little bit different because today it is not a normal episode. I am flying solo. Michael Rowntree is hit the vacation, the sabbatical that he gets every year. I say sabbatical. It's like a week and a half vacation where he's out with his family. Really want to help him in all of that. So we're running the show solo, but we've got a great guest on the line. But for those of you who are watching, man, you've been blessed by Remnant Radio, or maybe you've been blessed by this episode. We'd encourage you to give in the links of the description of this video. A couple different ways to give. You can give on PayPal or Patreon. It helps support the content that we do because we're entirely crowd-funded. If you give on Patreon, you give as low as $5 a month. You get access to extra content. We have this really cool book club that we've been working on, Kingdom of the Cults. We've got every single week we go through a chapter on Saturdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Central Standard Time, and we just kind of get together on a Zoom link there. That link goes up on Patreon the day of, and we discuss a different chapter of this book. So hope to hear from you guys in that coming up. But I want to toss it over to Dr. Hall. Without further ado, can you tell us a little about yourself and your ministry before we dive into our subject matter?
Sure. Yeah. I'm really happy to be here with you all today. So I am, I think, maybe a little bit different than your average person on the show in that I'm not a theologian. I'm a psychologist, and I'm primarily an academic psychologist. I teach at Biola University. I've been there for about 20 years, and a lot of what I do these days is research. And the research that I do, I'm very interested in pulling together the insights from our faith with the insights from psychology as a way of trying to help us just move forward on a lot of topics that have to do with Christian living. And so right now I'm smack in the middle of a 3-year grant that is focused on meaning making and suffering, and specifically the ways that we as Christians draw on our faith in coping with different difficult things that come our way in life.
Excellent. Can you maybe just share with us for a moment some of the projects that you're working on? You said you're working on this research grant. Can you maybe elaborate on that? Maybe tell us maybe other books or articles, how people can connect with you maybe after this interview, because we only have an hour here, and I've probably consumed 4 to 7 hours of your content already, and am eager to see more produced. So how do people follow your content and engage with what you're doing?
You know, Joshua, most of my writing is academic writing. So it's, articles and professional psychology journals and that type of a thing. Probably the best way, if people are interested in following up on some of what they hear today, is to look at for several of the talks that I've given, some through the Center for Christian Thought at Biola University and other venues. I think just Googling my name brings up a number of those different talks that might be helpful to people. I'll also mention that my husband and I, and primarily my husband, but since you're talking about books that might be accessible, we just released a book this past month called Relational Spirituality. And it is kind of a denser book, so it's for thoughtful Christians, but it's available on Amazon right now, and that gives kind of a big picture background on the lens through which I view spiritual growth through kind of a psychological, relational lens.
Yeah, that's great. I think this is one of the subjects that because of the West and where we're at, and the idea that our whole purpose in life is to mitigate suffering and find a way to bring ourselves the most maximum amount of pleasure, mitigate as much suffering and mitigate as much pain as possible for what would be essentially hedonism. Man, the idea of suffering is something that is so underpreached, underemphasized in the pulpits. And man, it's one of those things that everyone goes through. Every single Christian, to some level or another, according to James, going to encounter these various trials, right? Different kinds of trials, whether they be gospel-related trials or just human condition trials, the nature of a fallen world, those kinds of things. I would like you to kind of maybe articulate to us why is it that the doctrine of suffering, the teaching of suffering, is so underemphasized in what would be, I would say, Western evangelicalism. And I think your research actually shows that there are other Christian traditions that may actually emphasize it rightly. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
It's interesting. We're all, how should I put this? We're all bound by our worldviews. In other words, we take kind of the way that we view the world as normal, and unless we have some opportunity to kind of step outside of that and kind of get an outsider's glimpse on just kind of our working assumptions about the world, we typically don't question it. And so it's kind of interesting. As I'm a clinical psychologist. That's my training. I've spent lots of hours sitting with people that are suffering. I've been a Christian my entire life. And yet, I think it took my own experience with cancer a few years ago to realize how absolutely thin my theology of suffering actually was. And as I spent more time reflecting on that, I realized that there was a sense in which that was just what I had imbued from my culture, that even in the really, very good churches that I had attended all of my life, the emphasis was not on addressing suffering as kind of a normal part of life, a part of life that we should, as you just mentioned, biblically we should just expect, but that instead it was treated as something unusual, something that if we just did things right, that we could somehow avoid. And I really think that is a function of the culture that we live in. We live in a really technologically advanced culture. We don't even have to suffer heat. I mean, I'm in Southern California. We had a heat wave a couple of weeks ago, and I just stayed inside and cranked the air conditioning, and I didn't even have to sweat, right? And so I think that that's the approach that we take to life in general, is just that we can avoid suffering. We have all kinds of things at our disposal to do that. And so when suffering that we can't avoid hits, it feels like there's something wrong, in a sense, like
Right.
something, it surprises us, right? That obviously is not the case for many segments of the world, parts of the world that don't have the technology available to them. Even within the United States, there are segments of the Christian church, such as the historically black denominations, that clearly have had to deal with a lot more of just kind of everyday suffering in life, and consequently that's reflected in the way that they do church, right? It's different than kind of the evangelical, primarily white segment that I'm in, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, can you maybe unpack, like, just so we can work on a definition of suffering? I think there is a view of suffering that is, I would say, almost trivial and silly, in that we will compare ourselves to a person driving a Tesla with the newest iPhone, and here we are just slumming it, in our Honda Civic and our Android phone, right? Comparing ourselves to the person who has more, and because of the greed of our own heart, we interpret that as suffering. But can you maybe give us a good functional definition of what suffering actually is and what it looks like?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's kind of the external event part of it, right? I think that's what you're referring to, right? Whether we're driving the Tesla or the VW Bug or whatever it is, or when a tornado comes our way and we lose our home or whatever it might be. But that's actually not the best way of thinking about suffering. Pain is even not the best way of thinking about suffering, because we can think of instances where we voluntarily go through pain because of something good that will come our way because of it, right? I think of childbirth. I think of the training that athletes sometimes do that is quite painful, but it achieves a certain end. And so I like the way that Eleanor Stump, philosopher Eleanor Stump, thinks about it, because she talks about an aspect of suffering being when we lose something that is the desire of our hearts, when there is a block there to what we desire. Now, the interesting thing about that is that sometimes our desires are very trivial. And so, I mean, there's a sense in which if your world revolves around um, the getting the good things in life, there is a sense in which we could say that you are suffering when you don't drive the Tesla, even though I would say that's entirely your fault because of the things you set your heart on,
Sure,
right?
sure.
But yeah, it's more of an internal state in response to the things around us, rather than being defined by the things that happen to us.
Okay, so um, let's maybe start off in like why a trial? What's the reason? What's the purpose for a trial? And probably not in the um, why is there evil sort of way, but like what's the purpose? We believe in a sovereign God who's in control, and if God is in control of all of these things, and this is supposed to be for our good and for His glory, how are Christians to view a trial, and what is it? What are we meant to think of this process?
Yeah. I'm going to leave aside, one of the aspects of what you're asking, which has to do with kind of God's role in bringing hard things into our life, right?
Hmm.
Whether God causes bad things or whether He simply uses them. So I'm going to leave that aside. That's a theological question. Regardless of the origins question, there is kind of a functional answer to your question. It has to do with the purpose of everything. And I think that regardless of what we think about the origins of hard things that come in our life, I think the biblical message is very clear that the purpose of hard things that come into our life are always about shaping us, forming us. Uh, I would say essentially shaping us into Christ's image for the ultimate purpose of being in a closer relationship with God. So, Romans 8:28, we pull out that verse all the time when suffering comes. We know that God uses all things for our good, but we sometimes miss that in verse 29, he goes on to say that it is the shaping of us to be in conformity to Christ's image. And so I think we really have to put a lot of emphasis on that when we think about the way that God is using suffering in our life.
Yeah. So when you talk about personal, it's personal application, um, future glory, right? There's an eschatological end to the suffering that we can look forward, knowing that there's going to be this future glory we have access to.
Mm-hmm.
There's a present sanctification that takes place, and then you mentioned a present intimacy. There's like an invitation of intimacy into this relationship with the Lord. That last one was the most impactful to me when I was listening to your lectures at DTS. I was on a treadmill, just kind of walking, wasn't even running, walking on this treadmill, listening to your lecture, going through something that wasn't like, again, world shattering heavy, but like really just wrestling with the why in all of this. Like this just feels like it's going on too long. Why? And I've always viewed like the James chapter 2, consider all joy when you encounter various trial. James chapter 1, knowing the testing of your faith produces endurance. Let endurance have its perfect work, perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. So I've got this idea that, man, I'm going to go through this trial. I'm going to go through this difficulty, this strain, and on the other end of it, not during, but on the other end, like this trial has got this like, I forget what the word is that I would use for it, but it's just so practical. It's so pragmatic. Like, oh, okay, there's this purpose. But like when you're going through something forever, if you've got cancer, and you're chronically ill, like the idea that for the future, it's so soul sucking that it's like, man, like God really wants me to be perfect, and this really stinks right now. Like thinking of the joy that could be years of this, that could be decades of this. Like man, like what am I going to do? And listening to you talk about that intimacy piece, could you maybe unpack? I think it was Philippians chapter 3 in particular that you discussed about knowing Him, the power of His resurrection, and the fellowship of His suffering, and how suffering actually invites us into a place of intimacy with God.
Yeah. Um, yeah, there's all kinds of places that I want to go with that particular question. So let me start
If
off by
I don't
just,
want to, bottleneck you into Philippians 3. If you don't want to do Philippians 3
yeah.
and you'd rather go another route, I get that.
No, I'll come back to Philippians 3, but I just want to say that is there's I think that thinking is very familiar. When you're describing kind of the way that you view the James passage, I think that is really kind of I think it must be cultural in the ways that we tend to think about suffering.
Hmm.
And I think that it might have to do a little bit with that triumphalism, right?
Yeah.
Where we're kind of focused on the end goal. We're focused on, like you said, the payoff, right? And then what we miss is the whole process. What we miss is the whole experience, where in a sense we have to put kind of real life on hold while we're going on the suffering. And the only thing that really counts is what happens at the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right. I think one of the really important things is to recognize that what's in the middle is also real life and is also really important. And one of the things that I've really been struck with in the interviews that I've done with people who are going through suffering is how they often reflect on how some of their most prized times, the things that they, um, the, the times when they feel so close to God in the midst of what's happening, that they actually miss that. On the other side of the suffering, when they've come out of it, they reflect back on those times of just the closeness, of savoring that intimacy with God that they just miss, right? And yeah, so I think that when we skip over that, when we miss the importance of that, that we're really kind of losing the whole point of why suffering might be allowed in our lives. Now, you had brought up the verse in Philippians, which is of course a very, very important one, in chapter 3, where Paul talks about his desire to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the sharing of his sufferings by becoming like him in his death. And so there's a knowing of Christ that Paul seems to only experience in his sufferings. And it, that that does, I mean, suffering was at the center of Christ's identity. He biblically, he is the suffering servant. And so there's a sense in which only when we're going through our own suffering and using that as an opportunity to draw close to Christ, can we really experience that part of intimacy with Christ. So I think that there is kind of an overlooked piece there in terms of we might call it the opportunity in suffering of drawing close to Christ, sharing in his suffering in some way.
Do you think that, so I don't know if I put this connection together in my head after or while listening to the sermon, or if it was, I think it was actually in your talk. I'm thinking of, Jesus, he's in heaven, eternally God, and in a moment condescends into the form of a child in the womb. I mean, he's the size of a lima bean. You know what I mean? From and not to stretch this illustration, but you've got this this image I have in my head of Aladdin. Unlimited power, itty bitty living space. Like he not that he emptied himself of such power, but that he embraced this weakness of humanity. Not a subtraction of divinity, but an addition of weakness, an addition of his human nature. And when this happens, Christ is now sweating. He is now actually being sustained through an umbilical cord by his mother. Like a human woman is now sustaining Jesus. The food that she is eating, which is something he created in the past, is now, now he's being gravity. He's subject to gravity, like well, not for long, eventually he rises through the clouds, but you know what I mean? Like there are these natural things that he has created that he is now subject to. He sweats. He is bullied. He's, this whole process of being just so human and suffering as a human, stubbing his toe, cutting his foot, whatever, those kinds of things we think of, I went straight back to the garden and thinking about Adam and Eve, and like he's naming the animals. These two they're similar, they're alike, and because they're alike and similar, they can commune with one another. And he realizes there's none like him. And he makes Isha, and Ish and Isha decide, hey man, we're bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. This is a woman, and he's able to commune with her. And it seems as if the author is trying to get you to view the parallel of how Adam is created in the image of God, and it's because he's in the image of God that they're able to commune together. And I think of this image of Jesus suffering all the way through his life, through a fallen and broken world, but also on the cross for righteousness' sake, suffering for the gospel, for the good news. And then I think of us suffering in our life, and then suffering for the gospel, for righteousness' sake. And I just think, man, we're being literally conformed into his image, that when we suffer, we look more like Jesus so that we can commune with him. Greater level of similarity. Would you find that to be too much of a, is that an overstatement? You want to pick up there?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. With the caveat, I mean, I think one of the things that we always want to avoid when we're working in the area of suffering is to somehow glorify the suffering itself, right?
Right.
So it's not so. I mean, maybe the way we could put it is, it's not the suffering itself; it's the way that we approach the suffering, right? That is going to be doing the work of helping us to conform to Christ's image and that type of thing. But aside from that caveat, I think you're exactly right. And again, it's not just, how shall I put this? Sometimes with our emphasis on the parts of Jesus' suffering that are so different than ours, right? The carrying of the weight of all the sins of the world on himself, the abandonment, the cry of dereliction on the cross. We think of those things that are not the suffering that we are going through, right? They're different kinds of suffering. When we focus on that to the exclusion of all of the ordinary life sufferings that you picked up on, then I think that it's harder for us to think about identifying with Christ in his suffering. But as you mentioned, and I think it's a really important point, he suffered all kinds of just ordinary life suffering, the limitations of living in a broken world. He was a refugee. He lost his father at an early age. He experienced homelessness. He was marginalized in society. He was misunderstood by his family. I mean, these are types of suffering too that are ones that we can really resonate with, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's. I've got a background. My heritage, if you will, as I was raised as a child, was predominantly in the Assemblies of God, so classical Pentecostal denomination, and they actually valued and maybe even idolized suffering, specifically the suffering for the gospel, like missionaries, martyrs, that kind of. If you got mocked at your public school for preaching the gospel, I mean, you were a hero, That being said, the other kinds of suffering, such as I'm infertile, or my kid has a disability, and like I'm having a hard time caring for them, or like the more natural forms of suffering that are byproduct of the fallen world that we live in. Those kinds of things were, not directly, oftentimes in some camps, not the one I was directly in, those would be chalked up to not having enough faith, right? Like if you have enough faith, you get persecuted the right way. But if you don't have enough faith, you kind of suffer the wrong way. Can you maybe speak into that space as well, in like why is it that some idolize certain kinds of suffering but don't value others?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. My background is very different, so I'm having to think through that a bit. I
Sure.
think part of it. I think part of it is, again, the cultural backdrop, right, of the triumphalism, that life as a Christian is supposed to be one triumph after another. And so what that does is it says that if you are living the right kind of Christian life, then you really shouldn't be bothered by hard things in life, right? Because
Hmm.
what do they matter? It's all going to burn. So it doesn't really matter what your losses are in this life or your limitations or things that you endure. Like you said, the only kinds of legitimate suffering, the ones we're allowed to pay attention to, are when we are suffering for Christ, which is very narrowly defined, right? So I would guess that it has to do with just kind of that general cultural assumption in our evangelical circles that it's all triumph, it's all victory, it's all the end of the road, and what is happening in kind of the here and now doesn't matter that much. Um,
Can you maybe unpack to us like the connection between worship and suffering, and how suffering well is actually a tool for worshiping God?
this is where lament, of course, comes in.
Hmm.
And so if we think about lament, or if we think about the Psalms in particular as being kind of the model for worship that's packed into our Bibles, the ancient hymn book of the Israelites, it's really, really striking that maybe as much as 40% of them are what are called Psalms of Lament. In other words, they are pretty much focused in their majority, in kind of the bulk of them, in kind of crying out about current sufferings, about hard things that people are going through. The interesting thing about the Psalms of Lament is also that they don't stay there, that they end in expressions of confidence and trust and worship of God. And so I think that that is one kind of, I would say, connection between suffering and worship, is that in the process of expressing our suffering to God. So again, it's not the suffering itself, it's what we do with it, right? But in the expression of that to God, in taking it to God, in recognizing who God is and God's ability to take our suffering and do with it whatever God wants to do with it, and surrendering it to God, we get to a place where we can actually trust God in the types of profound ways that make worship very, very genuine. So it's not just worship based on God giving us good things, right, in life all the time, but also recognizing God's absolute sovereignty over even the hard things that are coming in our life. I think that's a much fuller picture of God when we recognize his sovereignty over everything, right? And his ability to bring good things into our life even through the toughest times. And so I think that worship, once we grasp that, once we are able to surrender that to God, really is kind of the we might even say logical outcome of the enduring of that suffering.
Yeah, I think of times that people have really suffered well, and on the other end of it, they come out with this greater trust, this greater adoration. I think you even said that in your research, you talked about people who had gone through a season of sickness, and on the other end said, "Oh yeah, I have a better relationship with God. I know God more. I trust Him more now than I did before and during and through and all the other." But what about people who are like, they're in the midst of it right now? Like, if I just tell that person, Romans 8, man, like God's going to work it to good and consider it joy. And they're like, I'm still barren. Like, I still am very sick. Like I've learned after pastoral counseling that a lot of times I just need to like be still and like let them talk and kind of grieve. And had a girl the other night talk to us, they're wrestling with infertility, and she told me, thank you for not offering to adopt. Like, thank you for not telling me the very first thing, like trying to fix it by saying there's tons of adoption agencies. Like I want to have my own kid, and but how do you navigate that space? Because that's one of the reasons that suffering is so undertaught, is we don't know how to suffer well with one another. We don't have to bear in each other's burdens. We don't know how to do that. Like, if someone's going through like chronic illness or real like heavy suffering, how do we bear that burden with them?
So there's several things that I could say here. One of the things I want to say is it's actually worth encouraging them to bring that suffering directly to God. I think one of the side effects of not having lament just made it kind of a routine thing in our congregations is that sometimes people feel like bringing hard things to God is a form of maybe complaint or grumbling, and so they would rather do that kind of outside of God's presence. And I think that there's something very important about actually taking our suffering and all of our experiences of it, right? Even the kind of unacceptable, quote unquote, feelings that we might be having in the moment, and knowing that we can bring those to God. So I think it's worth saying that some people might need the encouragement to actually do that, right? To actually bring that into their relationship with God. The other very important thing that we can do for people is simply to be there. My own experience has been that there are actually not very many people that are comfortable with just sitting with somebody while they talk through and try to create meaning out of their suffering, try to put the pieces together. As you said, we're much too quick to just kind of try to fix it for them. But some research shows that actually the more intentional processing, the more intentional meaning making that people engage in as they are processing suffering, the more growth that they report at the end of their suffering. And so there is real value in the even repetitive process sometimes of just talking through again and again what might be happening in people's lives. Yeah, and again, I think it's actually fairly rare for people to have the patience and their own trust in God to just be able to kind of sit with the messiness of that. And so when that happens, that's a real gift. I remember I mentioned that a few years ago I went through a cancer experience. I was 45 at the time, so fairly young for cancer, and I had a wonderful support system. My family, my church really rallied around. But one of the best gifts that I was given was a close friend of mine that I could really fall apart with. In other words, I had some really kind of irrational fears, and they weren't ones that I felt very comfortable just talking to anybody about. My husband was very good about listening to me talk about those things, but then this friend of mine, I just felt the freedom to be able to just be very raw with her in terms of just these deep-seated fears that I was going to die. And it was a real gift that she could just listen to me and encourage me, but without, feeling like she had to fix it. So I would say it might seem like a small thing, but being able to be with people in those places can be very helpful. Maybe the third thing that I would say, and I could go on here for a while, but I think maybe the third thing I would say is to introduce people to the practice of lament, because again, I don't think that it's something that very many people are familiar with. And I would say that it is kind of a God-given structure for us to help find meaning in our suffering, to help us get to that place of praise. And so I would say that it's even reading through the Psalms of Lament, even voicing the verses of praise, even when they're not coming from our hearts, but as we read through it, as we follow in the pathways of these Psalms that were given to us for the shaping of our hearts, really, it can help to create a structure for meaning that we can step into. I guess what I'm saying is words don't just express what is in our hearts, but words can actually work the other way. They can shape our experiences. And so if we're willing to put ourselves in the pathways of, expressing our hearts and then having that lead to a place of praise, that even though it might not come quickly, it will eventually get there. It's a way of, I would say it's a spiritual discipline in a way of shaping our hearts, of helping our experiences, our emotions, to be shaped by who God is.
Do you find that people, I mean, there's a lot of charismatic platitudes, that I have to work through and figure out if these are actual things. And when it comes to, God will give you a test. And if you don't pass that test, you're going to retake the test. And it's kind of a funny little platitude, but like in my experience, it's not been all that wrong. There have been a lot of people that I've been around who've gone through a measure of suffering that wasn't necessarily engineered by their own bad decisions, right? But it's like the guy who needs patience, and God sticks him behind every red light and every slow driver, and it's like he keeps being forced into these positions where he must learn patience, but it's difficult because he's impatient, and it's like, and until he learns that lesson, these kinds of things continue to happen. And it seems as if people who go, and that was kind of, again, maybe a trivial example, but it seems as if there are certain individuals who will try to ignore the suffering by medicating, whether it be through, food, alcohol, entertainment, sports, like some way to like not process this experience. Would you say that you found that is true, that people who don't really embrace the suffering in a way to like, again, process it, focus on it, to learn from it, that this process just starts all over again?
Oh, I would say that's absolutely right. Uh, we really have to go through the suffering in order to reap the benefits. It can't just be avoided, We can't just push the feelings deep, deep down and hope that somehow they'll go away. That's just not the way that we're built as human beings. Yeah, I mentioned even a couple of minutes ago that the research clearly shows that the more we intentionally engage in processing through our suffering, the more we're going to see reported growth at the end of it. So it's absolutely essential that we allow ourselves in God's presence to think through what does the suffering mean? What are its consequences for my life? How do I want to move forward in dealing with it, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, very important. And I think you're also right on that distraction is a huge temptation in our society. I think more so that at any other time, entertainment is more and more of a temptation. It's just so easy to distract ourselves just around the clock. That it's a real temptation, I think, for Christians, not just in engaging with suffering, but engaging with all kinds of different important aspects of life, relationships, purpose, things that we need to be moving toward in our callings and that type of thing. But at the end of the day, it's going to leave you in a place where that stuff is just going to have to come up again and maybe in more extreme forms, right? I mean, if we don't deal well with the suffering is going to affect us in unhealthy ways, right? So it's actually a very dangerous move to just distract ourselves, because the feelings are going to affect us no matter what. Yeah.
Yeah, in your research, you've talked about those who, have this greater trust and in God's sovereignty and His control. Susan asked a question in here, in particular. I'm gonna distill it down without reading every single word here, but it seems as if there is a, if we believe that every single suffering that's going on in my life, all the sufferings that are going on in my life are actually God trying to teach me a lesson or to sanctify me or for this future glory, then for me to pray against a sickness or a disease or some kind of family issue that's going on in my life, some kind of strife, some kind of drama, that if I were to get in and pray, like, Lord, would you heal me of this sickness, then I would actually be praying against God's will, who's the one who's doing it. So how do we create this worldview that says, hey, all the suffering is Father filtered, but maintain an expectation and faith in praying that God would resolve these issues?
Yeah, it's really a great question, and one that I can actually resonate with. I remember struggling when I was first diagnosed with cancer with how I should pray about it. I wondered if it was okay for me to, ask God to heal me from the cancer. I was very grateful when other people would pray for me, right? But I really wrestled with whether it was okay for me to do it. I think what's really helped me is to understand, to distinguish between kind of my beliefs about the origins of suffering and my beliefs about the function of suffering. We tend to kind of lump those together in our minds, but they're actually two separate things. So I think it's important for us to think about what God desires for us. What God desires is good things. At the end of the day, sin is what brought suffering into the world. I think that the picture of where we're aiming for eschatologically is a world where there will be no suffering and no pain. I think it's always in God's will to pray that God's kingdom will come, which means the eradication of sin and suffering, including that in our own lives. So I think there's a very clear answer for that. Pray that the suffering will be taken. That's modeled all over in the Psalms of lament. People are crying out, "Take it away, God, take it away." So I think that we can move in that direction with a lot of confidence. I think the better way is to think about that God can use anything that does come into our life for our good. So again, it's origin versus function. God can or God will use everything that comes into our life for good. I think it's a separate issue to say that it came from God's hand. So that's kind of the way that I think about it. Yeah.
It's good. Maybe when we speak into those who are in a Christian worldview, but I don't know, this almost sounds atheistic, but like if we have this view of God who's in heaven, who is causing or using suffering in a way where he could get involved, like no one denies that God knows it's there and knows and has the power to intervene, but allows for whatever purpose. Some people, I think, especially in the non-Christian space, would look to this God as a kind of a mean, sadistic, like torturous kind of being who just allows his kids to suffer horribly to teach them some kind of lesson. I mean, they would look to the kid who sudden infant death, and the parents who just mourned that, or the person who has been riddled with diseases for decades, that they look at that and they go, God's teaching them a lesson? Like, what a brutal and mean thing to do. How do we as Christians not rob God of his sovereignty, but still maintain a view of God against those kinds of accusations against the Christian faith?
I wonder if there's kind of two ways that we should think about this situation. So I think that there are some answers to that, answers that, they have some problems, but that I overall think are satisfactory, right? That have to do with theodical claims, right? That have to do with, kind of logical ways of answering the question of why God might allow suffering in the world. That I'm very happy to let other people do kind of the intellectual work in that area. That's more of a kind of a philosophical and a theological area. I just want to acknowledge that there are, like free will theodicies and that type of thing that help to answer those types of questions. What I would say, though, is that from an experiential position, there is kind of a pastoral answer that I think is really, really interesting, that has to do with the fact that a lot of people who do encounter suffering experience it as God's loving hand in their lives. And I think that there's kind of a burden of proof on the people who would say that it's a sadistic father to have to prove that that's what's happening when the people that are experiencing it are experiencing so much love from God and so much of a sense of intimacy from God and a sense of God's hand in their lives as they're going through suffering. That was really one of the surprising things that we found in some of the interviews that we did with cancer patients. One of the people on our team is a philosopher who does work in theodicy, and he was very interested in the types of theodicies that people kind of brought up in the context of their interviews about their cancer. And one of the really fascinating things is there were actually very few people that we interviewed that struggled with God, that we, really thought that, to put it in your words, that God was a bit of a sadistic parent, right? That simply was not the way that they were experiencing it. They were experiencing their suffering as a place where God really drew close to them, where they saw God's power in some ways that they had not experienced before, where they recognized God's omniscience in the way that things were being played out in their lives. I mean, there was a sense in which their experiences were the opposite of kind of the need for theodicy. They didn't
Mm-hmm.
doubt God more, they doubted God less than they had before they went through the suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so I find myself not worrying that much about what people on the outside have to say because my experience is often that people who are on the inside are experiencing God very, very differently, right? So I'll leave that to the apologists and the people who are able to articulate those defenses very, very well. Um, but it doesn't worry me that much, from at least in my experience and the experience of people that I've worked with. Yeah.
So I've got a question here by I think the username, because it's all one word, UK Dove Girl, I think might be it. She says, "Hey, 22 years of evil pain, worst condition in the world. How do I accept half a life not lived? I think she meant punished. Am I wrong?"
Hmm.
This is something that again, from the not the non-Christian side, but the Christian side, for the Christian who's experiencing suffering, one might say, "Man, I feel like the wrath of God's on me. What did I do wrong?
Yeah.
Do I
Yeah.
need to repent? Like, what's going on?" And then there's others who they want to blame God for their situation. Like, "Man, why did you do this to me?" Are those things okay? And how should we process those? So those two different questions. One is,
Two
should
different
I feel
questions.
punished? And the other one is, why did God do this to me? Um,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Let's see. How do I tackle this? So, when I tell people that I study Christian meaning making and suffering, I have
Hmm.
had people say, well, you're a Christian, so wouldn't it be more technically Christian finding and suffering? Because, we know the truth. And so, aren't you just finding what is actually true about the way that the world is? And, after thinking about that for a bit and thinking through the interviews that I've done with people about how they think about their suffering, I think meaning making is actually the better word because as Christians, we have all kinds of different ways that we think about suffering. And then we have all kinds of different ways in which we apply that suffering or those views of suffering to our own circumstances. And I would say that not all of those ways of thinking about our suffering are um, are equal in the sense that they're not all particularly biblically grounded. There are better and worse ways of thinking about our suffering. And the idea of suffering as punishment is clearly, a thread that we see in among Christians in different circles where people either feel that their suffering is a punishment from God, or even, of course, we've all heard these terrible stories of people going through something terrible and having someone, a pastor or somebody, ask them what they did wrong that God was punishing them for, right?
Right. Yeah.
I don't really see that as being a very strong thread in the Bible. In fact, the place where it's the clearest is in the book of Job. And it's in the mouth of Job's counselors that we learn as we read through the book of Job were just absolutely wrong about why there was suffering occurring in Job's life, right? So I think that framework of of suffering as God's punishment, while we might see a little thread here and there in certain specific biblical stories, is really not the main way that suffering is presented in the Bible. And so and let me say one thing more. There is some psychological research on the ways that people think about their suffering and how it affects outcomes. And one of the things that's very, very clear is that whenever people think that their suffering is a sign of God's anger or a sign of God's punishment of them, then the outcomes are going to be worse. More depression, more anxiety, more just separation from God, et cetera, et cetera. So I would encourage you and I'm talking here to the person who sent in the question, to maybe reconsider that even though you feel a certain way, that might not reflect the way that God is thinking about the suffering in your life. That if you can find some way of prying loose your assumptions about what the suffering means in your life, that if you can get away from that idea of it being God's punishment of you, I think that you might find some ways forward in terms of being able to experience God in the midst of your suffering in very different ways. And again, I point you to some of the Psalms where people are just really raw in the way that they talk to God about the suffering that's going on in their lives, and are able to find God in the midst of that.
Yeah, that's good. Um, what are those kinds of? I mean, would you say, man, the Psalms are the place to go? Lamentations is the place to go. In one of your lectures, you said like 40% of the Psalms are laments.
That's right. That's right.
And how to process that. We need desperately, in my estimation, as an authority of a YouTube channel, right? Like I'm not really an expert in any field here. I don't want to pretend to be, but I think we desperately need a robust view of suffering and the way to process that suffering through lament. How do we reclaim that as a church? How do we practice this as a church? What are these on-ramps, pastors watching, congregants watching, they're raising their kids. Like, how do they teach their families to suffer well?
In the readings that we choose to use on Sunday mornings, to make sure that it's not just the last 2 or 3 verses of the Psalms of Lament that are the ones of worship, that are the ones that are read, but the entire psalm. In the hymns and choruses, you have to look hard, but there are some that are laments, basically, that are bringing up the hard things and that don't jump to the end of the story too quickly. I know that Michael Card has developed a number of songs of lament. Those are worth tracking down. It might be a way of incorporating them into services. I have seen some upcroppings of liturgies of lament that churches are coming up with and using in, for example, prayer services, where they lead people through kind of corporate experiences of lament. That would be another way of doing it. I'm in a non-liturgical church. I have been all my life, but I do think that this is one of those places where more liturgical churches have an advantage, in the sense that they can't escape from certain parts of Scripture. When they are reading certain things and they just come up at certain times of the year, then they're exposed to the whole range of it. Those of us in non-liturgical churches, I think, are more subject to just the ways that our culture forms us. And so we keep coming back to this, but when we have this kind of upbeat, avoidance of suffering type culture, it just makes sense that we would gravitate toward those parts of our Bible and leave out the ones that really substantively address suffering. The other passage, of course, besides the Psalms of Lament, the other place where I've spent quite a bit of time, because there's just so much richness there, is in Romans 8, where we have just some gems about, for example, the Spirit groaning on our behalf so that we're not left alone in our suffering, but we know that the Holy Spirit is there expressing our suffering in words, even when we're not able to put it into words, in God's presence for us and shaping us in that process. So there are definitely places where we could land in Scripture that would help us to develop this more robust theology of suffering.
That's good. And that's one of those things, we typically are going to cover the how do we have these conversations on these theological principles or these philosophical constructs that we use to understand the Bible and understand Scripture and understand God's plan in redemptive history? But there are these episodes like this one that just have to be covered, because I don't know. Um, I just think it's so neglected, and I think that it's so essential for Christian development, for us to really have a good view of this. On this channel, we cover quite a bit of charismatic stuff. We're continuationists, and then we believe that the gifts of the Spirit have continued. But I actually think that to have a healthy culture that believes in those things and practices those things, they need to have a high view of God's sovereignty. And have a high value for human dignity and human worth and human suffering, and look at those things in the midst of that, and not treat Christians in the church who are suffering differently than we do as second-class citizens. And I think that is something that can happen and has happened historically, and I've seen it happen, at least in my Christian tradition of the charismatic space, where we would say like, hey, this kind of suffering acceptable, that kind of suffering a lack of faith, and they're treated as second-class citizens, and people hunt after the guy who's in a wheelchair every single week, and they pray for him and he feels targeted. And we've got to create a culture where suffering is not only acceptable, but that suffering is a tool that is used by God, and having an understanding that we trust him and we kind of relinquish that control. When we talk about suffering, in our way of processing it, we've talked about worldview quite a bit. Can you maybe weigh in on individualism, Western individualism, and our desire to want to be in control of things? Does that cause our suffering? I don't know. I'm just thinking of a personal experience. Sorry, I'm ranting with this question, but my son, is at home, and I came home. I was a couple months ago, maybe 2 months ago, and I'm just like red in the face. You could tell I was crying, and he was like, "Dad, what's wrong?" And I just looked at him and I was like, "Buddy, Dad wants to be God, and he's not. Like, Dad wants to be in control. Your dad wants to be sovereign over all of his circumstances and his situations, and he just can't be in control. I can't be God, and the pride of my heart, I want to be." And he looked at me and was like, "Yeah, I get that." Like, my 7-year-old's like, "Yeah, Dad, I'm not in control of anything either. Totally understand." Do you feel like that there's this lie that we get to be in control is actually makes the suffering worse? It's like it exacerbates it.
Yeah, absolutely. Psychologists cover, something, or they talk about this thing called belief in a just world, right? And
Mm,
so the idea here is that, we have these kind of working assumptions. We might call them part of our worldview, although it's not, theological. But we believe that the world is just. We believe that we get what we deserve, and we believe that we're good people, so we deserve good things, right?
mm,
And so then when bad things happen, we're surprised. Our first question is why? Because why is an expression of like surprise, right? This shouldn't be happening because I'm a good person and I deserve for good things to happen to me, right? So, clearly that's a very faulty part of our worldview that we, again, because we live in a society where we do have so much control over the world around us, we sometimes buy into it, even as Christians. Um, so that's definitely a part where our individualism comes in. But the other thing I want to say is, just that there is this long Christian tradition of recognizing that suffering can be so powerful in the sanctification process in our lives. And I think that it is precisely because of the issue that you talked about.
mm,
Because when we are suffering, we hit the wall of our finitude. We hit the wall of what we are not in control of. We can control so many things, but when we have these desires of our heart and the events in our lives just face us in ways that we can't avoid, with the fact that we have no control over this thing that's desperately important to us, then that can be a really, really beneficial thing in our lives, right? Because there's a sense in which it strips us from the illusion that we are in control of our lives. We walk through our days thinking that we control the events in our lives. And in that way, we are limited in our ability to acknowledge the control that God has in our lives, the loving um, uh, omniscience, omnipotence, everything that God is. And the fact that as creatures, part of our flourishing is to recognize our utter dependence on God. So suffering can really be a gift in that way, in helping us to recognize what is always true, which is that God is ultimately the one in control, and we are creatures that are dependent on God. The more we can internalize that and live our lives in light of that, I think that the more we can flourish.
That's good. So we have this kind of section where we do at the end of our show where we ask our guests to kind of give us that closing nugget, that little last golden nugget, people walking away with, they can meditate on and think about as they're going on through their week or their day, so forth and so on. So let me ask you this: what would be that one piece, that one thing that you would say when thinking about suffering? Meditate on this because it'll be fruitful. Maybe read that book, check out this blog, this article. This is something that was helpful for me. What's that kind of piece that you would have people walking away with thinking about? And
So
don't
I
feel
would,
bad if nothing's coming to mind instantly, because usually I toss it over to my co-host, who gives you a moment to think of that answer. So don't feel bad at all.
no, I actually have something that I'd really like to leave folks with, and it's this idea that it really matters the way that you approach the suffering that comes in your life. Again, our knee-jerk reaction is going to be suffering, intrinsically bad. Only thing I can do is to get rid of it. But there is this really kind of unique way that Scripture talks about suffering in our lives. It actually talks about it in terms of a grace that is given to us. I'm thinking here Philippians 1:29, where Paul says, "It has been granted to you on behalf of Christ to suffer for him." And that has been granted to you is the translation is a little wonky there. It's really it's a grace that has been given to you, right?
Wow.
And I think that when we approach it with this mindset that it is an opportunity to recognize who we are before God, to draw closer to God, to identify with Christ in his suffering, that suffering can actually become a road to greater flourishing. We can come out at the other end of our suffering, not just having survived the suffering, but having a life that is more meaningful, having a life that allows us to be more the kinds of people in relationship to God that is kind of the ultimate aim of all of our life as Christians. And so there's a connection between suffering and glory that is just a consistent thread throughout the New Testament that I think we can really cling to when we're going through those hard times, and that can make all the difference.
That's awesome. No, I love it. And I think that even human nature points to this. There's an old military phrase that misery loves company. And the idea is if the guy that you're doing push-ups with during basic that you suffered with under the sergeant or whatever is going to be your best friend for the rest of your life. And because you're going to take bullets together, you're going to be in a foxhole and they're going to be, mortar shells going off around you. And the misery that you suffered together bonds and unifies you in this unique way that no one else has access to. Like, this is my blood brother, but this is the guy that I suffered with in a foxhole. And I'm just closer to that guy because we suffered together well. And I do think that even that illustration makes perfect sense to us. But when you replace that guy in the foxhole or that guy doing push-ups with Jesus Christ, it places this beautiful emphasis that God has invited us into fellowship. And for me, and that was the piece from your research, from your lectures that I came away with, just being blown away with, being super encouraged by, is that this is not an opportunity not only for my development for the future or my character development now, but this is a real present way in which Christ is fellowshipping with me, that I get to be with him. I get this, if you will, a unique access to intimacy with the Lord through this suffering and being vulnerable with Him. Man, it was a blessing to me, and I want to encourage people with that. For those of you who are blessed by this episode, man, I would encourage you, subscribe. Make sure to like the video, subscribe as we're coming out with content just like this. And we want to remind you that we're entirely crowd-funded, entirely supported by viewers like you, as the great PBS used to say. So there's a couple ways that you can give if you'd like. You can give. There's links in the description of this video. You can give on PayPal as a one-time gift, or you can give there on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/The Remnant Radio, or check out the link in the description, you give as low as $5 a month to get access to a whole bunch of extra content that we produce. We're doing a believer's guide, kind of a beginner's guide to theology. Michael and I are working on. In addition to that, we do the book club where we read one of the chapters from Kingdom of the Cults and go through it every single week and discuss it live, Saturday between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. Lots of other content that gets uploaded there. I think we interviewed a guy from a Reformed tradition that went to Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry. So all kinds of eclectic stuff there on Patreon that you get access to. But maybe you're out there and you're like, hey, I can't afford $5 a month, but I would still love access to that content. Shoot me an email, media@theremnantradio.com, and I can send you a link to that. No big deal at all. Know what it's like to be broke. Anyway, that's that. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Remnant Radio. Dr. Hall, thank you so much for coming on the program. I really enjoyed the discussion and have been super blessed by your ministry. Excellent, guys. See you next time. Blessings.